Hey everyone, my name is Leslie Rangel. I'm Senior Editor of Investigations for thebarbedwire.com. I'm so excited to be in this conversation today with my good friend EJ Johnson. EJ and I talked about the story that I recently wrote. It's the headline is "Who Owns the Dead Inside a Texas Family's Fight to Honor Its Ancestors." This is such an interesting, intricate story that unfortunately we can see in the South is not unique to only a certain group of people and certain people. This is a story that unfortunately many people who have ancestors in the South can really relate to and see some of the parallels. And EJ, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background, your expertise, and what you thought about the article.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Leslie, for inviting me to have this conversation. Thank you for also doing this article and doing the research. I'm excited to hear more about why you decided to dive into doing this work. And it's a really important conversation. For context, I have deep roots in Texas and deep roots in Louisiana. And so on my father's side, we go back several generations all the way to enslaved folks in Texas. And so have stories of family members who are a part of that first initial Juneteenth celebration. On my maternal side is deeply rooted here in Louisiana, and I'm coming from you in New Orleans. That a lot of my work in history really deals with Black history and Black preservation as a documenting filmmaker, especially around Black narratives and stories here in Louisiana. And this particular article really hit home because this is a regular conversation in Louisiana where there's so many plantations. Louisiana was one of the largest slaveholding states. And so many burial grounds, particularly of Black folks, are now on private properties. And so stories like this, as you mentioned, are very much so across the South for many communities, Black, Latino, Indigenous communities, and even outside the South as well. So.
Yeah, that's so incredible. And it's so interesting, like you said, to see all of the parallels. And that's one thing that was really interesting to me in this story is I think a lot of people, we think about 2025 and even just what a map looks like in 2025, right? But a lot of people don't realize that centuries ago in the late 1800s, the South was a giant section. And in fact, Texas, as I'm sure you know, was part of Mexico. Like that's what it was. And the people who lived on this land, I hear this saying a lot, but the border crossed them.
Mm-hmm.
And so this gets a little bit into what the story was about. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So I got a tip from a researcher who is a doctoral student at the University of Texas at Austin. Her name is Diana Hernandez, and she is the founder of a lab called Reclaiming. And what I thought was interesting is that her work, specifically through her research, really focuses similarly on what you're doing, EJ, on preserving these spaces, preserving spaces from the Black community, preserving spaces of the Mexican Americans and Mexican natives who used to live in Texas, as well as the LGBTQIA plus community. And her mission is to make sure that people have access to their ancestors. She has a really unique story, but she gave me the tip and she said, "Do you know any journalists who's interested in doing this?" And I said, "Hello, me." So she shared with me that there's this woman who lives in San Antonio, 63-year-old Lulu Francois. She had been wanting to pay respects to her great-grandmother for quite a few years. Now, EJ, I don't know about you, but I know in my family, there are certain parts of my family that for one reason or another, either we didn't talk about or we didn't know they existed, or unfortunately, in families of color, there's a lot of family trauma, family that you didn't know existed, a brother or sister you didn't know was your brother or sister. So in this case, Lulu did not know that her great-grandmother, she knew of a great-grandmother somewhere along the lineage, but she didn't know specifically that her great-grandmother, Paula, was buried just a few miles north of San Antonio in Comal County. And then when she decided she wanted to go pay respects, She had no idea what kind of a legal fight it was going to be between a private ranch owner and a property owners association. And then, again, just the bigger question, the headline, who gets access to the land? Who owns the dead? Who actually gets the privilege of reconnecting with their roots and being able to connect with their people? And so I know you read the article. It was filled with family history, family secrets, allegations of possible grave desecration. There's questions on, are there more bodies buried in this cemetery? And so it's been a whirlwind of a story.
Yeah, and thank you for really shedding light on kind of the back story behind it. And one thing that's really interesting that I see now, that as a person who is really passionate about doing family genealogy, I am excited to see, but we have a lot of Black and brown folks are really getting more into their family research, right, in genealogy. And as you mentioned, for a lot of families, there are a number of secrets. And anytime someone starts this journey, I always tell them, be careful. You don't know what to expect, and kind of go into a very open mind, because things come to light that you might not have expected. But within this, people are also looking for their loved ones, and they're looking for a lot of things that we might not initially be thinking as roadblocks that will come up as roadblocks. We have an area in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge known as the river parishes, but essentially you can go back, and speaking of like centuries, as you mentioned, in the 1800s, there's like a map that shows all the plantations from New Orleans, like up to Natchez, like Mississippi. And so the whole area of the river is all broken down to plantations. But particularly in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, a lot of these areas now owned by chemical companies. But a lot of these areas, of course, these plantations had Black burial grounds, and many of which were still being operated even past the days of slavery emancipation. And I think even your story was talking to this. We think about Texas in particular, you had Black folks who were still sharecropping, but you also had a lot of those in the Latino community doing the same thing, working on these private lands. And so working on the lands, living on the lands that they actually did not technically own, but then they're also getting buried on the land. And so now you're buried on private property, essentially. And as time has progressed, we have a lot, particularly in Louisiana, these former plantations are not owned by private companies. And it has become a story that a number of people are starting to look into, because locals can't go visit their loved ones. And sometimes they literally can see the graveyard right there, but now it's a private company that owns it. And, as you pointed out in the article, in Texas and other places, there are technically these laws in place, but, always who's actually upholding these laws. It becomes very hard as well to try to get access to see, your loved ones, things of that nature. And then particularly for some of these graveyards that have still been operational much more recently, now that it's private property, is it somewhere, that you even want to be buried in, and you want to be buried next to all your family members that have been there, because now it's hard to access that land. And so I think these are things that we're seeing a lot more, particularly as we think of places in the Southwest where we have Latino families, as you mentioned, the common saying, the border crossed us. And so now we're dealing with land that was, that was once ours, maybe not ours, and we're buried on this land. We think of Black folks who have been working and laboring on land for many generations, and now it's private property. You think of also indigenous nations, and there are these indigenous burial grounds everywhere, but the land is now private property. And so I think it's actually a conversation that I'm hoping your article and other people are hearing. There's groups like the Descendants Project here in Louisiana doing this work, that people really understand that this is a big conversation that we need to have. And I feel like it's going to be a bigger one as people are doing their family work in genealogy, realizing, particularly for people of color, a lot of times our ancestors are not buried in places we can easily access, especially just even a few generations prior. And, I feel blessed in some respects, because where my family was here in Louisiana, a plantation, but it's at the historic church. And so I can go visit them. But I know there's a lot of other Black families in Louisiana whose, family ancestral grounds on a plantation is private property, and they can't access it as easily. And so I really resonated that a lot with the story, and they're going back and forth with the landowner, and can I go see? And it's a lot, and that takes an emotional toll on the individual as well. And that really becomes a blockage in trying to really reconnect with your roots as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was one of the big things that was so interesting to me as I was reporting this is, I came into it thinking, oh, okay, well, and as a journalist, as a reporter, you always want to let the story lead you and take you to where it is. You don't want to do like preconceived notions on, well, I think it's this or I think it's that. You really do let the reporting speak for itself. But also, I'm human, right? So I came into it thinking like, oh, well, maybe this family just needs to get in touch with the landowners and they'll chat and it'll be fine. But then you realize, as you said, you start to uncover the many layers of who thinks what and why and what they heard and different aspects. And I was actually really bummed that I wasn't able to get in touch with the landowners, the the descendants of the German family who own the piece of property. It's the Elbel family ranch, and so back in the mid late 1800s, this land was settled by folks who were from Germany, and they had a working ranch, as you shared. And we unfortunately don't know the ins and outs of who worked there or how big it was and things like that, because they chose not to comment for our story. But it's interesting seeing again the history of things. And I'm curious for you, because this was a conversation that came up with Lulu, the woman who's in search of trying to connect with her ancestors, was why is it so important to connect with your ancestors, and why is it important to connect with that history? And the reality is, I mean, our history is ugly, and my opinion is that it's important to connect with our history so we know where we've been and we understand where we can go and how we can shift things, and what are some of the mistakes that maybe our society made earlier on, and how do we prevent those? I mean, because the bottom line is people were considered property back then, and so people are buried on people's property. And now, again, that question, who owns the dead? So, in all of this, I'm curious to hear from you, EJ, on why do you think it's so important to connect with your ancestors and to know where you came from? Why is that so important for people?
Yeah, you actually just made a really, really good point, Leslie. And I think one, if you understand the current day in 2025, and it's January 8th now, you have to understand history. And so, for example, the fact that families are having a hard time even accessing this, their family members in these burial sites, comes from history. And so you have to know that literally what happened, so many generations ago, it literally is in effect to this day and its age as well. And for a lot of Black folks who do genealogy work, this is a common theme that comes up in a lot of these spaces, is that if you're doing your family research, and a lot of times in Black genealogy, people will call like this block you get to, which is essentially right when your family lineage will hit slavery. And then from many folks is then trying to figure out, can you figure out who those folks who owned your enslaved ancestors and how much information can you get with them? And that's met with a lot of different approaches. For some folks, they can't really get any information. And it's common that those families who owned your ancestors might have records that talked about, them being property, but they may or may not want to share that information with you, or you may or may not be able to get a hold of them. And so much of you trying to connect and know more about your roots is so dependent on this particular person or family that have all this information or access to your ancestors, whether it be the actual land that they're buried on, or as you mentioned even like a second ago about like the records. And so more than likely there are records. And so, but then who has those records? And then, what are the rights of the descendants of the people who were enslaved or sharecropping or working the land, that they have the rights to that knowledge as well for their actual ancestors? And so to your question, we really can't understand today without understanding that past, because it literally is the facet, everything around us here in Louisiana. Like the chemical plants are not there just by random happenstance. They're at the exact location of plantations because those plantations want access to the rivers. So they can transport items up and down out of New Orleans, and the chemical plants want the exact same thing. So to understand why those chemical plants are there, you have to understand why the plantation was there. You understand the descendants of the people that were enslaved there, now also the people who live in the highest area of cancer, known as Cancer Alley here in Louisiana, which is, has a huge area of folks getting cancer, but all of this history links together and it's not separated. And so even as we think about, history, it really tells us today. And so in order to truly move on and understand why we're in the situation we are today, we have to go back. We have to look at the history. We have to acknowledge the history. And as you mentioned, it is a lot of hard history. Our country has a lot of hard history. And so these stories really help to allude to what we are going through today. And then that's how we can start to figure out how do we make better decisions moving forward, particularly in the future. So
yeah, absolutely. Not to quote Beyonce, but I have to. But there's a lot of red in that red, white, and blue.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I'm also a big Beyonce fan, probably similar to you, as you know, and that's really a part of that quote. And what that means is that there is a lot of red, and I think that we're trying to uncover that and talk about those real situations, and stories like this in the article that you've written help to really bring more attention to that. And so, and one thing I am curious, Leslie, is like, have you seen yourself as one that really wants to kind of dig deeper into the historical pieces and things like that? And then even how has this article and work really like changed your perspective as you think about history and like how history plays a role and particularly in Texas and things of that nature? So
yeah, well, I appreciate you asking that. It's, for me personally, it's very I'm like at a loss for words on how to explain it. To me, frankly, it's a little emotional, to be a little vulnerable with you, because the fact of the matter is my family lineage is I'm first generation here. So if I have kids or whatever comes next for me, like they will be the second generation. And as we continue forth, I think about what my dad used to always tell me. And he would say, remember your roots, Leslie, remember where you came from. And for me, I think about that. And it's this obscure little town in Mexico where he and my mom were from. And I also now have adopted, he's my stepdad, but I call him dad. He's from Guatemala. And so I've adopted those cultures because it's what I grew up with. But I even find myself sometimes, like even when I was talking through with Lulu and hearing her story on how, they could trace back exactly where their family was in Texas. And she knew of a great grandmother now. And then just the lineage of it and how folks can really trace back. Like, for example, I don't know who my great grandmother is. I don't even know her name. I only know as far back as my grandmother. And in a lot of ways, it was sad for me personally, because I almost envy folks who can trace back and are able to trace it back to that level. It's a whole nother journey to try to track your ancestry when it's all still in Mexico. I'm not familiar with that culture. I've never lived there. And when I say I'm not familiar with that culture, I mean in the today, like in 2025, like is there Ancestry Mexico? Are the records available? Did they have the type of filing systems that were developed here in the US? Because again, there was so much of the property aspect tied to it that, slavery ended much earlier in Mexico. And then there's a layer of colonialization and so it's a lot of layers. So that was really tricky for me emotionally, but I am interested very much so in continuing to do stories like this. In fact, we're in talks about a potential part 2 with this story, because through the work, I mean, if you look at the article that we have on thebarbedwire.com, you can see that there's an ID of a woman. And we don't know actually for sure, as I'm sure you got you familiarize yourself with through reading it, but we actually don't know if that is Lulu's great grandmother. What we do know, you talked a lot about the work and stuff, and things not being by accident, things being intentional. I mean, this farm is on a river. So
Mhm.
that is very intentional because, you have access to the river, access to water to be able to run a farm. So we know that this particular ID belongs to a woman who used to cross the border, and she was given this work permit, and that's why we have a photo. But unfortunately, Lulu was not able to confirm, yes, that's a picture of my great grandmother, because nobody's ever seen a picture. And so
Mhm.
while it's beautiful to have that photo, it's also a little bittersweet because, that could very well be her grandmother, but at the same time, no one will know for sure. So a lot of these aspects, like you said, of like, you find roadblocks, and sometimes you don't really know, when, especially when folks aren't for whatever reason, aren't wanting or able to be more forthcoming. So
In many ways, it's investigative work for a lot of families, especially families of color, to do this work and to really do the deeper dives. And so there are records out there, and a lot of times I tell people there are records out there is trying to find who has access. And I think like the work that you're doing is important. So I'm hoping that it becomes more of this that you're doing. And my Texas side comes not very far from this exact area. And so these stories, and particularly this story, was resonating because it's something that I know geographically very well. And so I appreciate you for digging through this and then helping to bring more of these stories to light. And hopefully encourages more people as well to do the same thing, to look into your family story and know who you are and where you come from. So
yeah, absolutely. And and like I said, this story, and you said it too, this story is not, I think that's what's really cool about journalism is, and really storytelling is, we shared this one woman's story, but as it woke something up in you, like, oh, this sounds really similar to my family story, or stories that I've covered before with my documentary work, or even just states, right? Like neighboring states. Like, this Texas story sounds so much like what was happening and is happening in Louisiana. And I think that's what my favorite part about storytelling is that when we can share our experiences, it really just brings people together, and helps us, in my opinion, just be a little bit more empathetic towards each other as humans. Because I feel like, of course, right now, we have to be real. We're all so disconnected in seeing each other as others.
mhm.
And when we can really connect and see like our stories are similar, and you may have some ugly parts and I may have some ugly parts, and how can we learn from each other to just treat each other as humans?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said exactly right. I think it's key. And I think that's the power of storytelling. I think as you and I have connected and bonded over, is that there's ability for other folks to see themselves in those stories and be able to really humanize stories. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is being able to humanize stories and people's journeys, and in particular, this one particular family's journey. But at the same time, I'm hoping that other folks see that and then also get inspiration to do that work, and also to stay encouraged, because it is, as you do genealogy, and as you saw in the story that you've written, it takes years sometime to do this work. But I definitely feel that is worth it, to honor our ancestors and the lands that the soil that they tilled, that we sometimes say in Louisiana, to honor them, to make sure that we can bring their names to life and their stories to life as much as we can. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautifully said. Well, I so appreciate your time today, EJ. This has been such a fun discussion to have. And for anybody who's interested in reading the entire story, it's a little bit of a long read, but it'll suck you in. So I've heard some folks share, but you can find that at thebarbedwire.com. And of course, connect with us. I am on Instagram and all of the other platforms. I am Leslie Rangel, 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 either way. And the Barbed Wire Texas. EJ, how can people stay in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I am the director EJ on Instagram and TikTok. And so I'm there talking about everything Black history, especially and preserving Black history and culture. And yeah, and so definitely connect with me there. And thank you, Leslie, for providing this opportunity and space for us to have this conversation. So
Yeah, absolutely. And reach out to us too. Like if you have questions about your family history, or if you have a tip or this reminded you of a story, reach out to both of us. If you get in touch with EJ first, and you can get in touch with me, or vice versa. It's all about storytelling and helping folks. So thanks so much.